All right, then. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Hey, do you ever think the bonus situation was the friends they made along the way? All right.
I mean, not really. It was
Hey,
friends they
family.
lost along the way. Yeah.
All right. So this is episode 18. Happy Valentine's Day to you. Is that possessive? I mean the word, not my
Oh,
saying.
I never know what to with all those holidays. Like Mother's Day, is it plural?
Yeah. Well, the search goes on. So what are we doing today? We're
Mechanical Turks. Mechanical Turks are for lovers.
don't derail my train here. So what we're gonna do is, last time we talked about, I was gonna run some of the, the sample clusters and topic models at the K of 5, which was suggested by the finding things I did, and then we were gonna take a look at that. Let me see, where did I find that? Yes, yeah. So it's tough to think how to get into this because it's a whole plexus of things, but let's just start with, so what I think our plan was going to be was to run these and then to do it also with bigrams and trigrams, and then do the same thing at a higher value like 20, right, of unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. And I did run some, let me share this with you. Let's see here. How do I, there we go. Share. Yeah, let's just share the screen. All right, so you can see my screen, yeah?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, I mean, I ran some other things just to sort of tidy up. This is a means to find K using structured topic models or structural topic models. And you can see here, it's not super conclusive, but it does point to some things like, notice after 20, how in most of these measures, the data gets
Right.
erratic.
Erratic. Yeah.
So this, I think, gives us a decent, now it doesn't have anything really special for 5, except here in residuals, you can see an inflection point there. But anyway, I think this gives us a decent bound in terms of 5 to 20, right?
Okay.
We've already seen, I ran, yeah, this is the hierarchical clustering, and you can see if
Oh,
you
yeah.
break it into 5, right? And I've broken it into 5 into 20 here. 5 makes sense, right? We've got basically, if you kind of look at this, it's like you just kind of count across, right? So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see that?
Okay.
You know what I mean? And so it demonstrates, yeah, okay, 5 makes sense, right? I mean, you could potentially see an argument for, what would this be, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe. But you can see, 5's not a big deal. 20, there's nothing necessarily magical there, but you can see it. And then what was the other? I think it did elbows. Yeah. And then just really quick, if we look at these, and then we'll move on. These ones show 5, right? Is a pretty clear elbow, actually.
Yeah.
And this, oh, and wait, these aren't they. Those, I bumped up to sampling all the way to 30, just so that all of them were going from 2 to 30.
Okay.
So that it would address if there was any weirdness about where it was ending, because these previously went from 2 to 20. And you could say, well, what if you missed something, But so I ran them again going to 30, and they're essentially identical, right? You see the
Yeah.
sort of characteristic elbow here at 5. Excuse me, and then it flattens out after a little bit of turbulence later. Anywho, so our plan was then to, do this at, let me stop sharing, to do this at 5, do this at 20. And then from that, remember, we were going to have categories. So probably the way that would go would be at the K of 20, we would take the ones that are suggested there and then collapse them together, right?
Right.
Because then it's very easy, right? If you have the category designations as 1 to 20, and it's like, well, categories 1 and 3 and 5 should just be collapsed. It's just a simple matter of changing the number, right? Okay, well, now they're all category 1, right? So, okay, so that's what we were planning to do. Then we were talking about, once we have those, either we would do it, or you might remember we were saying, should we work with other people on that? You remember?
Right, like bring in a group of, it almost Turker style, bring them in to help us sort through the categories and narrow them down to.
Yeah. So now thinking about that, I don't think that's a good idea, and here's why.
Okay.
Proceeding like that, for one thing, it'd be very difficult to set up. How would you reconcile people collapsing category? What if one group said, well, 1, 3, and 5 should go together? Another group says 2, 5, and 20 should. How do you reconcile?
Right.
And you can't even like average them because they're not doing the same.
Oh, that makes sense. You can't average trigrams or bigrams.
What's that?
You can't really average the bigram, whatever the things might be.
Well, even if we're just dealing with unigrams, think of it this way. If we gave everybody, if we took a junk drawer and dumped it on the ground and said, hey, could you sort this for us? And they say, sure, into 5 categories even, let's say. They say, sure, here's your 5 categories. And you say, how'd you sort them? And they'd say, well, these are blue, these are red, these are yellow. Say, okay, thank you. Next person comes in, sort it, 5 categories. What are they? These are squares, these are triangles, these are rectangles. Okay, third person comes in. Can you sort these? Sure, these are pens, these are photos. How do you average that out?
Right.
You can't compare those across, right?
Right.
So that, just walking into that, setting that up is a non-trivial problem. Secondly, from a theoretical perspective, what would we get from that? Because at the end of it, we could say, well, we all kind of collaborated and we came up with this. So let's check how it did, right? We collaborated, we used the machine, it gave us our categories, which by the by, even though it giving us a K of 5, when we look at the results here, that's probably not fantastic because there's a lot of information that gets lost, right?
Right. As we go out further, you see it's collapsing.
Yes. Yeah. It collapses stuff and kind of conceals that. But interestingly, even if you start with more categories and shrink them down, that's probably around 5 is probably a good number, because I've been doing this, and it's like the more there's a trade-off in categories between precision and descriptiveness. So that is to say, if we had 2 categories, I bet you the machine could slot them, or humans could slot them into those 2 categories nearly perfectly, right? Is it a hot dog? Is it not a hot dog? I bet you both humans and machines could sort that almost perfectly. But as you go up in precision, or in describing, right, in descriptiveness of the data set, say we told people sort this into 30 discrete categories.
Right.
Even if we gave you the schema of, this is category 1, this is category 2, suddenly you have to make these decisions that are much more fine-grained rather than coarse. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the fewer categories, the more consistency and accuracy you'd get assigning them to categories, but you learn less about the data set.
Right.
More categories gives you a much more fine-grained, but those results are just going to start going all over the place because someone's going to say, is this category 1 or category 17 or category 26,
Yeah.
So
now it's just Niels Bohr.
Well, yeah, it's like, theoretically, the optimum number of categories would be identical to the number of documents that we're looking at, right? Everything's unique.
Right. And then
but that's not helpful, right?
And then so at the end, we would just put them back where they already were.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't know anything.
We've got, 23,105 discrete categories, which is equivalent to the number of documents we have, right?
Right.
I know this number intimately now.
And they all precisely contain the original language that was in them.
Yeah. So anywho,
so is that, to continue the analogy, that's akin to taking the junk drawer, unpacking it, and just putting everything back right where it was.
We're just saying, here's a category that has precisely 1. Here's a category that has precisely 2, right? See, every item would be its own category, right?
Right. What's this category? It's this pen.
Right. Yes. The thing that is equal to this. A is equal to A. Anywho, this is kind of tangential.
Okay.
We got a lot to cover. And so theoretically, though, I mean, even if we collaborate to set those categories up, what if you then had that schema? Okay, we've got our 5 categories, right? We agreed, the machine did this. Let's check a few of them. So we pick any one of those 23,105 documents, and we say, okay, we agreed it should be this. But in looking at this, the language doesn't fit at all.
Right.
It's talking about a survey, and we had this as the category where you're transcribing data or whatever. It may not map to the actual thing, right? So even if we agree on this is what a good schema is, it may not accurately reflect the things itself, right?
Right.
So if what we wanted was an accurate reflection, here's what we'd have to do. We would take those, let's say 20 categories, we knock them down, you and me, because we know the data. We knock them down to around 5. We've got our 5 categories. I don't want to jaundice your perception of what those should be, but it could be something like, this is a survey wherein you describe your behaviors, thoughts, or feelings. This is locating information and transcribing it. This is summarizing information. This category is ones that are not human readable, right? That's a discrete category. This is recognizing an image or something like that, right? Those are your 5 categories, sort them. So we've got those. What we would have to do to make sure that those accurately match what's in there is we'd have to set those up, briefly describe those. We're into the realm of content analysis. Then go get people and say, all right, the 5 of you, here's, I don't know, 30 random posts, right? And I want you using this schema of 5 to assign each one to a category, right? Yeah. Then we check their inter-rater reliability to make sure they're in agreement about where those should go. Then we check how the machine did, right? To say, this is how humans would do it. Here's how the machine did it. Are they close, right? That's what we would have to do in order to set up a defense of why this is a good schema, because it accurately reflects the data. I mean, if what we want to say is that this codes things closely, sort of how people would do it, understanding that, because I've already tried this, it's not going to be perfect. It's just not, because the machine is making decisions probabilistically in most situations. And so when you look at that, it's like, it's not saying this is clearly a survey thing. It's taking all the categories and giving a percentage to each one of them. And whichever one is the highest percentage, it's saying it's mostly this. And keep in mind, again, those categories it's using, every time you run it, they're different categories. It's not even just slotting them in the different same categories. It's looking at the junk drawer again. So it raises this specter of, don't worry, there's light at the end of this tunnel. But like, I haven't been sleeping because I've been focused on sussing out the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know how I get.
Yeah.
And so the thing of it is, it's like, so you can control. The thing of it is, when we feed it in, it's not like the machine categorizes them this way. Let me pull this up. Let me show you what I mean.
Okay.
I'll try and tone down the mania. It's just I got a lot to get out.
No, honestly, this is compelling television.
So here's a perfect example, right? Each one of these is, here's the data, machine, give me 5, and I'm going to run it through a few different ways, right? So this is hierarchical, and you can kind of see here, right? This isn't useful. You're seeing this, right?
Yeah.
So, minute, study, survey, task, question, image, and okay, Hurricane Harvey. So we can kind of see what it's kind of talking about here. Let's try a different method, same thing, but using TF-IDF weighting beforehand, right? Different answers, some things, right? There's Hurricane Harvey again. Here's a whole category of non-human readable, right?
Yeah.
Here, some things are similar. Now we see things we haven't seen before, like well-being, right? Website. So the
Yeah.
machine doesn't give you, when you say, hey, machine, categorize these for us, it doesn't give you an answer. It can give you infinite, literally infinite
Right.
answers, depending on method. And then even within these methods, some of these methods are determinative, where it'll give you the same answer. You say, give me 5, and it'll give you the same one every time. Some of them are
Right.
probabilistic, where you say, give it to me, and it'll give you 5 fresh categories every time.
Right. And
And
so
now
probabilistic. So just to confirm, so let's say we're looking at cluster 1, and we've got the stem for minute. That what that means is that it's potentially for the machine running it. It's not definitively there. It's just more likely to be there than any of the other clusters.
well, the probability of it occurring in that cluster is high. That doesn't mean it
Okay.
can't occur. These aren't exclusive. You'll notice there are ones that
That's yeah.
the same term appears. Just because it's probable in this category, it's a little less, but still probable in the other category.
Okay. Okay.
And now, so even the ones that are probabilistic, you can control the seed. Essentially, you control the randomness by saying, hey, here's a seed. I was using 161 because that's my office number. And that way, when you run it, it uses the same random information. So you can control that. But here's the theoretical problem. Even if you control that, what's magical about one of these versus another?
Right.
What's the right? I mean, again, think of sorting the junk drawer. What's magical about shapes versus colors versus, writing utensils? Why is one better than the other? It's a theoretical problem of, it's what we want to see.
Right.
So all of this is
Yeah.
What's that?
No, I mean it reminds me of the Niels Bohr, right? Light is a wave or a particle, depending on that's not a practical limit. That's a condition of the world that how you measure it it determines what it is in part.
Yeah. So I mean, it'd be one thing if we could just feed this in and say, hey, machine, sort this, and it always gave us that answer, but it doesn't. I mean,
Yeah.
whether it's determinative or whether it's probabilistic, it can give you so many different answers to this, literally infinite. And so the question becomes, why are we selecting one rather than another? That means we kind of need a reason why, right?
Right.
And that reason could be because it's close to how humans would code this.
Right.
Right? And the only way to check that really is to have humans code and then compare. That's one answer to this. Another answer could be, depending on how you feel about this, well, you and I know the data, and this is, as we understand it, descriptive of what the data is. It's telling us stuff that we know is there through other means, frequency, familiarity. But you can see how potentially that response, it's like, well, there's the potential for subjectivity in that, right?
Sure.
As there is, well, no, there's not a potential. There is subjectivity in that, as there is in all things.
Yeah.
So all of this is kind of this question of, why are we doing this categorization? Why are we doing it, right? And I came to 3 answers for this. One, it describes to us the kind of tasks or the themes, the concepts that are in this data set, right? In a way that frequency doesn't, because it puts things together, right? 2, based on that, we can get things like proportion. If this is a category, right, survey, whatever, transcription, how many of those proportionally are in the data set? You see what I'm saying? We can, and I don't know beyond that what that means, other than, it sure looks like this is the predominant thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3, we can then use those categories to map to other data, as we talked about, right? Like, so a good example is compensation. If there's these 5 kinds of hits, you could look at the other metadata and say, how are those compensated? How are those valued? And are there differences there, right? So one thing essentially, or perhaps suggests, this is a more human task because it's monetarily rewarded better.
Yeah, we need to be able to map this on to that to really start to, yeah.
But
Oh boy.
if that's what we want, let's think of it. Okay, so we set up our categories knowing that these are fuzzy. These categories are, we do it, you hit return again, and it'll give you different ones.
Right.
We set them up. We say, these are the 5 types of jobs. Now let's check the compensation. Spoilers, I've done this. The range of compensation is so narrow. It runs from 0 to, if you cut off a couple of outliers, to a couple cents a minute. What you get in an average is not super useful, and it comes out in the wash because those categories are necessarily heterogeneous, right? So it's like they get the same average basically because those categories are kind of cutting across lots of, I mean, look at these words.
Right.
So that's not a good way to get that. So what's the other way to solve this problem? We want to know how they're compensated. What's the other way to approach this?
Yeah.
Can you see it?
After this commercial break.
Okay, I'm fishing you towards something, but we've got 2 things, right? We want to know what type of job and then how it's compensated. So we've found out here's the type of job theoretically, and then we want to see compensation. What's the other way to approach this? Switch them. Switch them. Start with how they're compensated. Okay. We know that. We've got hard data on that, right? That's a number. Now, granted, a number is never just a number, but you can just take we've got the reward, we've got the duration. It's just division to find out, okay, so what's the reward per second? And then multiply by 60 to get the reward per minute. That's a number. We take that number and we start our categories with that, right? Now, here's the thing. I don't think the best way, if you were doing that, is to like break them up into quintiles, right? The 20, 20, 20, 20, because there are certain types in here that are special. So for example, there's a whole whack of 0 compensation jobs. Your reward is 0. Now ask the question that everyone would ask upon hearing this.
Yeah, why would anybody do that?
Why would anybody do this, right? Where did I put that? Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so why would anyone do 0 reward hits? Largely because they're qualifiers. Yeah. You have to do this 0 thing before you can do jobs that are better compensated.
They're prereqs.
Yep. Are you moving because I'm shouting?
No, I had to go get socks. My feet are cold.
Okay, it's a better answer.
But it's basically like why students would take a 0 credit earning course.
Sure.
Because they've got to get to.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a category of this. At least according to this, the question is, does that manifest in the language, which we haven't done yet, right? But there are other reasons why you would do zeros. So things like to pump up your numbers as a Turker, the number of hits you've completed, right? Yeah. Even if you don't get compensation, it's like, well, hey, this guy's done 1,000 hits, right? Or whatever.
Right.
So
it looks like that's potentially one of the sometimes the qualifications for these, like any kind of social network like this, you get certain access to things based on your experience.
Karma, whatever, credit.
Yeah, that's not to get ahead of myself, but that's this heteromation book that I've been reading. We talked a little bit last week. When they look at examples of this, they look at things like Turk, but also they look at video games where people do a lot of work for which they're compensated other ways, but not monetarily. So
okay. So let's think of it this way. Let's start with the categorization through monetary compensation. 0 rewards, that's going to be its own category because it's its own animal, right?
Right.
Now step up. Should we just go everything that's compensated? Maybe. But if you look at the ones that are 1 cent, there are a lot of 1 cent compensation ones. They also serve a similar kind of thing. It's not identical, but I mean, it's the minimum you can possibly do, right? Those are minimum level jobs, right? You can't go any lower than 1 cent. And so those actually have their own, just from poking around in it, have their own kind of traits. So let's say those are 2 categories, 0 compensation, 1 penny compensation. And that's in terms of the reward, irrespective. Irrespective is a word, yes?
Yes.
Of reward per minute. Just
Okay.
straight up, if you get a penny, it doesn't matter what the time is, right?
Okay. Okay.
If you get 0, then the math doesn't, it always zeroes out anyway. So we've got
Right.
0, we've got 1, and then we've got everything else. And here's the kicker. Combining 0 and 1 penny jobs is a fair whack of the overall. I mean, it's like a third or so.
Wow.
It's a lot of them.
Yeah.
I just ran this, so I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but then we have the remainder. And so from there, it's like, well, should we just break that up into 3, third? I don't think so, because then again, it's going to come out in the wash. I think what you're going to want to see is, let's say, the 10% of the highest compensated, because those are going to be unusual, right?
Right.
And in fact, if you look at these numbers, there are like, and as I said, there's 23,105 docs, right? Now, if you multiply the number of available hits, it's 5 million and change. It's 5 million and change.
Yeah.
And within that, there are a handful that are compensated well. Like, I mean, the break point goes from like, a few cents a minute. And then there's one that's like, I think it's $3 a minute. But if you look at that one, the description literally says, this job is for 1 person. You will be rejected if you accept this job. It's just a way to pay someone specific to do something.
Right.
So anywho, I think if we take, the top 10% paying, and again, when you're dealing with such a narrow range, it's, but take the top 10% paying, take the bottom 10% that are, 2 cents or, above 1 cent, 10% there, 10% there, and then the thick middle of 80%, excluding 1 penny and 0, right? That, I think, is going to be interesting. And unlike coming at this from, well, let's first figure out what the categories of job are, then see what the monetary compensation is, flip. Start with, these are inarguable numbers for what the tiers of compensation are. Inarguable. Now, you could say, well, but I mean, what's the difference between a 2 penny job where you get 5 minutes, you get 6 minutes? It's like, yeah, we're computing that, right? Because we're getting an average. Right. But it's like, where you get that number of compensation, sure, you have to make choices there, but we've got the numbers. Everyone who comes behind us would see those exact same numbers. Whereas trying to classify them by task,
right,
you're off the map.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and what's really this processing, right? Processing. No,
I've been awake for days trying to suss this out.
Yeah. There is no Carol in HR. No, it's this also gets at where we were kind of getting at last time, which is talking about the ways in which I had been thinking about this in terms of, right, we'd be able to understand how Mechanical Turks is parsing the human and human intelligence based on, for instance, the verbs it uses to describe the work. And then we moved into, well, maybe it's actually domains, right? But the more I've been reading, right, thinking about this as labor and as the production of value, that I also think it makes good conceptual sense to organize them not based on the language of the description, but the value that the system has placed on the labor. And starting with the compensation solves 2 problems.
Yeah. So here's what we do then. We start with the composition or the compensation, right? Those are our categories. Then we look at, all right, so what's in those categories? Uh-oh, did you blitz out? Oh, shoot. Let's see here. I'll just have to vamp while he joins again. Just me talking to a camera as I've always wanted it. So let me warm up. So what I want to say is we'll, once we have those monetary categories, we can then look inside those and say, what's going on in there? And there's lots of ways we potentially could do that, right? Even things like frequency and exclusivity, we could run clustering and topic models. 5 me a tick. Oh, I bet you he means give me a sec. We could run, topic. Oh, he's out. to find out what's going on in there. But setting it up this way answers those questions for us in a way that is automatically, there you are.
Hey, sorry, I'm back.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'll just repeat what I was working out in my head, right? So
Okay.
we group things by, hold on really quick. Okay, so we can see each other. I'm just going to share this again real quick. You can see this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, so we've got our categories by compensation tier, right? So then we can look inside them and see what's going on in those, right? You with me? You have
Yeah.
audio? Okay, okay,
Yeah.
I'm just checking. Because it looks different all of a sudden. And there's lots of ways we could do that. I mean, even just frequency and exclusivity of terms within those things would tell us. We could do things like run clustering and topic models within those categories, right?
Okay.
Because it would maybe, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Do it now, where we say, okay, we've got the 10% highest compensating. Now let's figure out what's going on in there, right?
Right.
So it raised this question to me of how we're categorized. This to me seems like a better way to go.
Yeah.
And so it does raise the question then of, so what does this give us? Like in terms of like even writing the paper, what does this give us? So for me, what I'm thinking is those three things I mentioned when we talk about categorization, right? Describing
Yeah.
the tasks that are in there. However, there's lots of ways to do that. 2, proportion. If you want proportion of cognitively type of task in there, that's when we get into the difficulty of, well, do we mean based on like how a human codes it? Do we mean based on our read of it, right? That's the tricky one, is this proportion. However, that may not be what we want anyway. I mean, I'm not, that is to say, it'd be nice to say there are these 5 kinds of jobs in the data, or of tasks in the data set, and that's according to how it scores in relief to how humans do it. And
Yeah.
so now we know 20% is this and 14% is that. That'd be nice, but it's sort of like at the end of that, do you just say, and so now
Right.
we know, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we could make some claims about, the nature of what's going on in Mechanical Turk, but I don't know if it's necessary. So that one of proportion, it's a lot. What I'm trying to say is it's a lot of work, and I don't know if it's worth it.
Right.
And the third one, this compensation issue, we should start with the compensation. We should work that from the other direction.
Yeah.
So what does running these get us? I think these are still, I mean, there's an argument you can say, well, let's just throw this stuff out then. We've got the frequencies. Let's just categorize by tier, then run our topic models and our frequent, internal frequencies within the categories or whatever. Let's just
Right.
throw this out. However, I think these are still useful. I just don't think we should use them for necessarily categorizing things by type of job because of the fuzziness. Or if you want to eliminate the fuzziness, it means you have to go to the next step of having human coders. And I haven't checked yet with IRB whether at that point those people are researchers doing coding or human subjects giving us survey data.
Yeah.
Because what they're doing is spot checking the machine, right? I mean, normally when you're doing like content analysis, and I think Scott talked to us about this, right? You train your coders, this is what it is, and then you set them loose to code that data set, and then you compare inter-rater reliability. But we're not having them do that. We're basically saying the machine's done the work. We want you to spot check to see how close it is. And see, I don't know if that would require IRB or not. I'm going to talk to Amy anyway, but.
Oh, I see what you're right.
You see, because they're not exactly coders. They're, I don't know what they are. They're spot checkers.
Right. And are they, and Amy's question is going to be, in what way are they at risk in that?
Well, and I mean, are there, yeah, and I mean, it's just survey data requires IRB. Is this a survey?
Right.
I mean, I don't quite, anywho. So, I lost my train a little bit. Oh, anyway, so these I think are useful, but I think the main purpose these serve is they surface things that would not surface in the frequency counts alone. Okay.
Right.
So here's a good example that I already found. If you look in the frequency counts, and I don't think I pulled those up, but the word cancer is not frequent at all. You'd never see it. I mean, it's in like the 100s, 200s. Doesn't matter if it's TF-IDF or in the bigram. It doesn't matter. It doesn't show up very high at all. Now, one of these, one model, SK means TF-IDF using a genetic algorithm. One of them identifies cancer. And it's like, is that interesting? So I just searched the raw data for cancer. And
Yeah.
look what it's paired with here.
Yeah.
I searched the raw data there, and there aren't a whole lot of them, but there is a sort of class of surveys about cancer survivors and their experience, right? And it's not a big one, but it seems to be the same kind of thing where we're talking about like this Hurricane Harvey survivor thing.
Right.
It's the same sort of thing where it's like, tell us your experience there. There's also a sample of them dealing with veterans. Which again, veteran isn't a super frequent term, but there's like PTSD veteran surveys in there. So these are all part of this plexus of trauma narratives, surveys about trauma. And that's really interesting because in terms of what a human can do and what a machine can do, you cannot ask a machine about its trauma. Not yet.
Right.
And even if you could in the future, the trauma it experiences, I suspect, will not be human-like trauma. Right?
Yeah, it'll be its own,
its own trauma. I don't think you can ask a machine, what's it like getting through cancer, right?
Yeah.
So to me, these things are super useful, but I don't know if we should use them to categorize type of job. To me, this utility may just be, it's diagnostic, sort of like frequencies, right?
Right.
It shows us themes, but I would hedge at saying, even if we blow up the K to 20 and collapsing those together, this is a good numerical understanding of the kinds of jobs in there, ones we could base proportion off of, right? 20% of the jobs are this. I think we could say, and I've started to do this, we can say there are coherent threads in here. Now, if you're asking me how many of the total posts are trauma narratives, any answer I can give you would be super fuzzy, super fuzzy. And it's not simply a question of plus or minus, this percentage. It's a very real theoretical question of how are you understanding this?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which
And
involves making some kind of decision about how to read it.
Yes. And unless we get something, pseudo objective, like, well, 5 humans were in agreement that these are trauma narratives, right? And the machine recognized that with a better than chance probability, because that's pretty much what we're dealing with here is, the machine does not map, not that I've seen. I'd be super surprised if its similarity to humans was high, because I was doing some testing just coding myself.
Yeah.
And there are ones where it's like, how did it decide it was this? It just doesn't, whatever.
And I would imagine the if you tested the machine against you and it was pretty much like you, that wouldn't necessarily meant that the machine was doing anything human-like.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Anywho, so the takeaway for me, I think, out of all of this was, I still think running this was valuable. I don't think we should just throw these in the garbage because it shows things. I think, in fact, we should push this further. And I think the way to do that would be, so here for example, this is a STM, a structural topic model. And you may remember way back when we talked about these, this gives you more than probability, right? This by default gives you other measurements like FREX, frequency and exclusivity.
Okay.
Which is a really neat measure because it talks about things that are frequent within that category and fairly exclusive to it. Not completely exclusive, but there's a ratio there of, it shows up a lot here. It doesn't show up much in others. That's what it is.
Yeah.
These other measurements of lift and score are also they're just other ways to get at significance. I mean, I can show you the math, but it's, you know, like any of these like algorithms, it's like, well, here's the math. Yeah, but what is that showing me?
Right. Right.
Well, it's just a measure. It's another measurement of significance that is not strict probability. That's really all it is. So to me, these are really useful because it doesn't just give you probability, it gives you things like exclusivity, right? So here, if you look at the probability, it's got study, complete time, receipt, shop, extract. What this is probably talking about, because there are a lot of jobs about this, is extracting information from a receipt. There are
Right.
a lot of jobs that are looking at receipt and transcribe what you see.
Yeah.
But then if you look at, okay, well, what's the frex here? Mental, readable, veteran. It's like, okay, well, so it tells you a
Yeah.
little bit what's covered in that category. So to me, this is the most useful of them because it gives you these other measurements readily. You can do
Yeah.
this kind of stuff with the other means of clustering and topic modeling, but STM gives it to you readily.
Yeah.
So
And just to clarify real quick, these are things we could do after we used compensation to
oh yeah,
categories.
definitely. Because what you do once you have, you know, the compensation, you just break them up into those 5 things, and then your corpus is each
Right.
one of those. You know what I mean? You got 5 corpi then, or corpuses.
Right. Okay.
You see what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
But anywho, I mean, even working with the whole whack like this, what I think might be useful would be bumping up K to 20. And then I haven't done this with bigrams and trigrams. The thing of it is, I don't know how useful it would be to do that for every one of these methods. It'd
Right.
be, you know, it'd take a lot of work, and I'm not sure it would show me anything that just doing this with STM isn't showing me. See, one thing that this showed me is that even though they will differently, like, you know, one identifies cancer, one I think talks about, you know, demograph, for example, but they're comparable. None of these are magic, and running structural topic models gives us all these other sophisticated measures.
Right.
So I think what might be a useful step is to bump up K, do bigrams and trigrams, but just with structural topic models rather than all of these others.
Right.
I don't think we're going to be missing anything to do that.
Right. Because we get quite a bit with this and don't necessarily lose much.
No, in fact, I think, and I tested this, I did this already, as I've done with all these. And when you bump up K, like if you bump up K here to 20 and you run a STM, these other things like cancer and demographics, those appear. They appear. Because, you know, you're dealing with such a much higher level of K. It gets a little sticky to read because imagine, like here we've got 5 clusters. Imagine
Right.
20 of these with 4 measurements
Yeah.
each. You
Yeah.
get a little bit in the weeds where it's like, you know, but you do identify salient things. Like, let me see. Yeah, like this is something that popped out when I was doing that. The difference between summarizing and transcription. There are a lot of jobs that ask you to transcribe. There are a lot of jobs that ask you to summarize. It's interesting to kind of look at, because those cognitively seem different to me. One of them
Yeah.
seems tougher, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
As teachers of writing.
Yeah. And so like even looking at that in terms of, are they compensated differently? Do they give you more time to do one rather than the other? And so I
Yeah.
was already kind of noticing certain things. I've got a list up here, but I didn't want to show it to you because I kind of want you to maybe look at some of these as well. And
Okay. Okay.
you know what I mean? Because I'm pretty close to it. And, you know, to a guy with a hammer,
That much is
a nail. Yeah. I'm going to pan over and show you my, you know, red yarn wall hanging here.
Exactly.
Anywho, so I think a productive step will be to take STM, bump up the K, and then run it with bigrams and trigrams and see what pops out. See what pops out, and that'll augment our frequency measures and tell us more about the kind of tasks that are or let's say the topics. Let's say the topics. I mean, that's really what topic models are for. The topics or kind of hit that's going on in there. I think it will give us a more sophisticated notion of that.
Mhm.
I don't think we probably should then use that to categorize those on a job by job basis. I think what we should do at that point is say we've got a good description of the thing as a whole, right?
Uh-huh.
These are, we know from the frequency and from these models, we know these are the kind of things that are being talked about in there, right? That's what we can say.
Right.
Then when we want to categorize, then we move forward and, pivot in the paper itself and point out, what we want to learn now is how are these kind of things valued or whatever.
Right.
So we set up those compensation tiers, do our evaluations then, and see, are these same kind of themes, and they do, these same kind of themes pop up in there.
Right.
I mean, they do because, to an extent, you're always dealing with the same data.
Right.
So the same stuff does surface, right? So, we can then, categorize by compensation and see of these things we've looked at, what's manifesting. 50 minutes. I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah. No, that's I think the switching it and using compensation, I think that's pretty fantastic. I think that's going to get us, it's going to solve all the problems you just articulated. But I actually think in doing that, it also I think conceptually makes a lot of sense too.
Well, see, so that was my follow-up with you, is in terms of an interpretive framework, because I sent you that sort of rough outline.
Yeah, the skeleton. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like in terms of an interpretive framework, it would be useful once we have, at the other end of this, that information about, here's what the compensation is. It does show potentially that there are sort of that, there are differences in levels of compensation and how that maps to kinds of jobs. So, that suggests this is more human or whatever. If we have an interpretive framework, a theoretical framework to explain that, or to, plug it back in, like in the skeleton I sent you, I was just using rough things like, the Polanyi's paradox.
Yeah.
But that would really just give us, okay, well, it fits it or it doesn't. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
it's sure enough, it fits his split, case closed. I mean, but that's not as interesting as things could be.
Right. Right. Yeah. So just quick, and we can talk about this next time because I think we're running short on time, which is fine. We can just keep doing more of these. And that was anyway. So this book I mentioned last time, this Heteromation by Hamid Akbiba and Bonnie Nardi. They're interested. They Mechanical Turks is one of their examples, right? That this automation that doesn't quite, that it's heterogeneous in terms of the ways in which it uses humans and machines. But what's interesting in terms of our sort of larger interest in the notion of a cultural technique are the things that they see Mechanical Turks as akin to. And so one of the things when they start looking at examples and they break it down into, they're kind of less interested in how the human non-human difference gets parsed. So they're not quite lined up with us because they're pretty sure they know what a human is. Nevertheless,
liars.
Yeah, but they talk about communicative labor, cognitive labor, creative labor, emotional labor, and organizing labor.
Okay.
And then they look at different, so they actually see something like the ATM as akin to a Mechanical Turk, right? It's a kind of heteromation where in essentially the human being, that the customer generates value by interacting with that machine, by saving the bank the money it would have to use for a teller, or automated checkouts at grocery stores. So it's interesting in terms of the way it sees those as similar to a Mechanical Turk. In a weird way, they're like the Mechanical Turk, except the chess players on the outside of the cabinet as opposed to inside the cabinet. But it's a similar dynamic. And so the sense I get is that when they've got a I kind of was reading it going, potentially it's not necessarily, it was, going to be too humanist for us to make sense of. But in many ways, it's actually, they're doing what we're doing, and they land on a definition, which is in the context of heteromation, which is about a capitalist accumulation of wealth. The human is the component in the heteromation that generates the value. And that's what a human is.
Okay.
The human is the thing that's in that interaction that generates the wealth for the within that system.
Okay. So yeah, I
So
mean,
mechanical Turks, right? The human in human intelligence tasks, what marks that human as a human is that they're what makes mechanical Turks worth anything to anybody.
okay,
Right?
I see. Yep.
That if there's no humans in that Amazon mechanical Turks, it doesn't generate any value for anybody. So that's what the human is. The human is the thing that's needed
It's a financial catalyst.
to extract value out of the heteromation. So I got to get more into it, but
Yeah.
what I'm interested in. This is why your move to put compensation first
Yeah.
is, I think, really telling. And then I think in terms of our larger trajectory, going back to our discussions with Dr. Kang and the precursors to automation, and then our discussion with Casey, that we'll need to start looking at not just mechanical Turks, but what cultural technique is it potentially participating in? The notion that mechanical Turks is here being related to things like ATMs,
Yeah.
self-checkout, but also like World of Warcraft systems where essentially, right, you've got, or it's one game, I think Legion of Legends or something like that, where League of Legends, right, where it got really toxic, right, and it was awful, and then they came up with these tribunals, right, really bad. And so they basically, right, use the players in the game to keep people from leaving the game.
Yeah, we
right?
saw that with Wikipedia too.
Yeah, and this is all sort of uncompensated labor that generates value for the company. But what generates the value is that human component.
Yeah.
That also, as we're getting at, also solves a kind of technological problem, so that that what they're really interested in from a kind of political economy perspective is really the inability to disentangle the technology or the technique from the value, right? That what the League of Legends is doing is solving both a technical and an economic problem at the same time, and and in such a way that it's impossible to untangle which is the economic and which is the technical problem.
Well, and something that may be embedded in this, because one of the things I picked up on, and again, I don't want to jaundice your perception, but in looking at this, resonated with what Amy Evans said about risk. I mean, if you think of like the League of Legends, the humans are at risk because it's harassment, right?
Right.
And as we're seeing in the data, and remember we looked at that previous article about Mechanical Turk made me relive the worst moment of my life for 20 cents, right?
Yeah.
The cancer survey is that kind of, this issue of risk. One of these defining things, as far as I can see it, that distinguishes human and machine is the nature of risk. It's not like you could say they're both at risk, but in characteristic ways. I mean, again, machine cannot take a cancer survivor survey. It never will be able to, seemingly.
Right, and unless they can get cancer, it needs cancer first.
Yeah. I don't want to paint myself into a corner, but
right.
So I mean, yes, I think what we'll need are these kinds of interpretive moves. Now the question also becomes, how broad are we going to draw this circle?
Right.
Because I mean, I think for this first product, just to keep it from becoming a behemoth,
right,
we want to be pretty circumscribed in terms of, we did these things, here's what we saw, and then that sets up the later two products of, potentially one that's more social sciencey and then potentially one that's more theoretical, right?
Yeah, no, so, I think you're right. A lot of what I was just reading in this book, I think, is stuff that will probably be make more of a splash in a later piece.
Okay.
But I think it's useful now, because I think even when we write this piece, and I think even within that piece, we'll probably indicate that this is part one. And so I think it'll be useful, even if we end up speculating, right? Even using a term like heteromation early on, and then using it to just look at mechanical Turks and then
Build
sort
that
of
one.
contribute back to that toward at the end. Yeah. Anyway, so, but I think particularly right, if we're going to make an argument about starting with compensation as our sorting mechanism, if we're able in that piece to make both a sort of computational argument for why we want to do that, I think it's also necessary that we also make a conceptual or theoretical argument for why we did that, right? That it doesn't just solve, like, we're not just doing it because logistically it made doing the project easier.
Right.
We're doing it because we think that's what we're trying to get at in terms of what's going on. So it makes that move to start with computation a much more powerful move.
Right. Well, and also I'll point out that there is existing literature. I always mangle his name, but like, I think it's pronounced Epiriotis or Epiriotis.
Okay. Yeah.
He has publications, and there are publications that do things like look at compensation and demographics in Mechanical Turk. I think that can be useful for the literature. What we'll want to do then is make sure we triangulate. Here's how we're not just repeating what these people are doing, right? So, I mean, that may be this conceptual interpretive move, right? Where we're looking in a fine-grained way about what is because most of those things aren't doing, like, they don't break them into, well, what kind of jobs are they doing, It's sort of large scale. It's things like, can you make minimum wage?
Right.
Geographically, is this third world? Is it first world? Whereas it doesn't do things like, questions of, theoretical questions of value, not that I've seen, or, questions of risk, right?
Right.
So that, I think, is, we can use that to triangulate and point out there's existing work, although again, it's also not in our field.
Right.
But we're not just doing a watered down version of that. We're, I think, doing an interpretive move that they aren't doing, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a sort of a third thing to do, right? That it solves a logistical problem with the data. It's also a conceptual move, but then it's also a thing that differentiates the project as a whole.
Yeah.
So,
and I think I put in that skeleton, although I'm not sure. I think I did that, sort of an empty slot for, let me see. Where would I find that? Yeah. MTurk is a relevant subject of study in other fields. Examples plenty in project notes under research on MTurk. Yeah, that's where it's pointing out the other things that folks have done, looking at those questions of, and, I mean, he is an economist. He's an economist. So it's definitely butting up against this kind of thing, particularly if we conceive of it as, compensation. So we'll want to make sure we, get familiar with that, and just sort of, so that we can, triangulate, right? This is what has happened in these fields. I think I tried to do this in the skeleton. Here's what we've done in our field, but we really haven't looked at MTurk. And so, it's that sort of, old move of, they've done this, they've done that, but they haven't done this, right?
Right. No, and I made my way through that David Autor's Polyani's, my voice is going completely now.
I'm the one
Polyani's paradox piece that was pretty useful.
Yeah.
It was long, though. I didn't realize it was like 50 pages long.
Well, and I'm not sure how much of that we'll use, other than just that parsing of the high and low, and how those both resist automation for different reasons, but are linked through that,
But we can at least put it in our works cited page with confidence.
Yeah, that's right. And I do think it can be useful.
Yeah. And there's interesting stuff too about the ways in which he becomes interested in something like environmental control. So this notion that skills don't exist independent from tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is not this kind of like that if you start looking at what makes a human, and you start with a list of skills that they have, you potentially miss something, because you abstract the fact that those skills don't exist independent of particular tasks. right? That those evolve at the same time. So it's skills don't really exist abstractly, right? They exist in particular domains or
and are highly contextual, historical, social, cultural. Yes.
yeah.
Okay, so we'll probably have to wrap things up. I think so. In terms of next steps, here's what I tell you what I'd like to do. I think what I'd like to do is for my next step, get those numerical or those compensation tiers. As I said, I've already got a sort of, a soft break because I think they'd be meaningful and we can make a good argument for why if we did something like 0, 1 penny, and then with the remainder, and those two are a significant fraction of it, at least of the 23,105. I didn't compute the fraction of the overall available hits, which again I said is in the 5 million.
Like 5 million,
But take those two, and then with the remaining, break that into top 10, bottom 10%, and then the thick middle. And then I think I'll set those up and then tinker around in those through different measurements, maybe clusters and topic models, maybe just frequency stuff. I want to get sense out of what's going on in those. I think that's going to be my next step. As I said, I think it will be useful. Am I still sharing with you?
I'm just saying you now.
Okay. I think it will be useful to return to the topic models that I've already done, and then, as I mentioned, blow up the K and incorporate bigrams and trigrams, probably just using STM, structural topic models. But I think I'm going to start with breaking them into tiers first and seeing what I can see there. I think that's a next step, a better way forward in terms of a next step. And then I'll return to this. And all this is to say, I think my next steps are going to be dealing with this data still.
Okay.
For you, I think you got a couple options.
Okay.
One would be I can turn this over to you or just post it on the, the project site so that in theory, everyone has access to it or whatever. So you can go through these with the frequency, because remember previously we had said, well, let's just go through the frequency stuff and pick out what we found. And I think there were some preliminary things there, right?
Yeah.
Even just sort of basic stuff like, well, we noticed that whole whack of non-human readable jobs. And
the ad hoc.
Yeah, right there. I finally figured out what this one, this comes up all the time, ISIN. I thought it was a STEM, and I was like, what STEM is that? It's not. Yeah. It's an initialism. ISIN is a stock identifying code. I'll
be right back, Letty.
Okay.
So go through the data sets. Yeah.
I think, I mean, you could look through these and the frequency stuff and the raw data. I mean, that's what I was doing and just sort of picking out what's relevant here. However, that might be a good step for you, or you might put that on hold and work on the, as you're doing now, like the reading and the theoretical interpretive stuff that would probably go, in the intro and probably as we're explaining the patterns we find.
Okay.
That might be a better first step, because I think in looking through this stuff, it might be better to wait until I've run, the higher K things, because otherwise you're just getting a piecemeal understanding of this.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it might be better for me to do all that stuff. Then we'll have more stuff to sift through.
Okay.
And it would just be at once rather than doing it now and then doing it again later.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, so I think then our marching orders would be, I will set those compensation tiers, see what's going on in there. If you look more into the research and the theoretical stuff.
Yeah, and start sort of building a conceptual case for those tiers.
Yeah, and what we could do is take that skeleton I've got and we can put that somewhere on the site so that way we can both edit it somewhere.
Yep.
so that we can kind of change it as we go. Cause that was really just me working my way, sort of thinking of this as a paper, what would that do?
Right. No.
Okie doke.
Okay.
All right. Well, we didn't actually go much over what we normally do.
No. And it was intense.
Yeah. Maybe now I can sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I think next steps for you are like a nap or something.
I got to get away from, because I mean, once you start getting your hands into this, it's just like there's so many permutations of this. At some point, it's like I'm just faffing around with math, but what am I doing here?
Well, there's no clean break. There's no like, how would you know when you're done?
When you're done, yeah.
So
yeah,
and that the nature of the task, and then your intellectual and emotional proclivities, this really is a monkey's paw scenario for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like, it's giving an addict heroin here. It's like, because like I was even thinking of questions of like data collection, because, we made choices in data collection. Like, you could say some things are double counted, which we did intentionally because we were sampling the data periodically.
Right.
But that means some things, it's like, well, this is just still there from the last time you sampled. And we did that intentionally, but it's like, oh, you could see that as it is, a subjective choice. You could try and eliminate those duplicates.
Yeah.
And then say, well, they're all unique, but at the same time, it's like, but that's not the experience.
No, because
our
decision to sample the way we sampled is we wanted to kind of see over time.
Yeah.
And so duplicates in that sense are important. They're not really duplicates. What they are is
they show duration.
Duration is the word. Yeah.
Well, and you can get duration in other ways, but it this way reflects duration in the data. It's like, it appears more because it was there more, I mean,
there's always jobs like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anywho, I mean, all that's neither here nor there. It's just, once you start getting into this, it's just, it explodes in a million different directions. You think it's like, well, I'll just run the numbers. It's like, oh boy, I've just opened a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Anywho.
Okay. Well, on that reference to Greek mythology, that means it's the end of the episode.
All right. We know what we're doing. I'll see you in a couple weeks.
All right. 2 weeks. All right. Bye.
Yep.